Welcome to the NGO Committee on the Family in New York. We are a committee of NGOs, all of whom have been accredited by the UN, and we share a commitment to promote the vital role of the family in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN. I am Lynn Walsh, co-chair, representing Universal Peace Federation. And let me briefly introduce our executive committee members. Vinny Santoro is my co-chair. Andreas is our treasurer, who's also doing tech today. And Roshana Chin is member at large. Tori is our recording secretary. And not everybody could make it today. Am I forgetting somebody? And fortunately, Marcia's not here, or Elizabeth. But anyway, this is our wonderful executive committee. So please join us. We have monthly meetings. We're going to have a meeting May 14th during the International Day of Families. The title will be Strong Families, Strong Futures, Education and the Path for Greater Equality. So you can join our committee via the website. It's only $25. Andreas will put our website address in the chat box. And if you join by the end of May, you can vote in our June elections. Please, everybody, mute yourself. I said, please mute yourself. We will have question and answers after all the speakers have presented. So please put your questions in the chat box. And Roshana Chin will be very ably hosting the questions. Okay, all right. So we're going to discuss the demographic turning point, fertility, family, and what comes next. As you all are aware, global population is declining and it's becoming increasingly a concern, now affecting more than 3/4 of the world's population. Most countries are well below the replacement rate, and it's not easy to bring it up. So the serious economic and social implications of declining birth rates are receiving growing attention, and even at the UN. So in light of these developments, we have invited a panel of really great experts to offer their insights and perspectives. So I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Anna Claire Flowers. She is a family policy fellow at Archbridge Institute and the lead author of the state Childcare Regulations Index. She's an instructor at the Catholic University of America's Bush School of Business. She has a BA in Public Administration and a BA in Economics at Samford University, and she's now working on her PhD. In general, she studies the impact of economic policies on family formation and family decision-making. And we are really happy that she presented for our committee last year at the UN during the Commission on Population Development. So we're really happy to have her back. She will be presenting on overcoming barriers to parenthood, innovations in childcare, and family-friendly housing. She'll survey positive advancements that are being made in childcare and housing, so she has good news. And she will suggest policies that are most conducive to progress in these areas. So, Anna Claire, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. And let me just get my slides shared. But thanks all for being here. It's encouraging for those of us who are, working on these issues to see that people are interested in tackling, at least discussing some of these big questions. And when it comes to the demographic turning point, I mean, yeah, it may seem like what we are talking about today is just a drop in the bucket, but um, anything helps. And we're talking about what's next, then I think childcare and housing are two areas where we need to be paying attention. Um, so, like Lynn said, my name is Anna Claire Flowers. I'm a family policy fellow with the Archbridge Institute. Actually, just defended my dissertation, so I almost have a PhD, and that was mostly focusing on the childcare industry. Um, but today, like I said, I'll be talking about economic barriers in a couple of industries that are most relevant to family formation. Um, Childcare, housing, I'm sure we could name a few more. Let's make sure these. All right. Um, so when we're talking about issues related to falling fertility rates, it's easy to focus our attention on what to do more of. Lyman, I think, will cover cash incentives today, and there are certainly viable policy proposals out there for actively supporting families through tax credits and other benefits. But when it comes to childcare and housing, less is more. This is what we've seen in the research. Less is more because although regulations have stated goals of safety or quality, they do have an impact on what business owners can do to meet a diverse range of family needs. We know from a couple of recent empirical studies, one of which I've gotten to be a part of, that more economic freedom or fewer policies on business practices specifically is associated with smaller fertility gaps. And I will explain that in a second. This is because with fewer barriers, the business community actually seeks solutions to families' problems um, as a way of operating and earning profit. So it's up to the business community to kind of help solve some of these issues that um, are preventing families from growing. So let's take a closer look at fertility decline before moving on, and I'll show you why I'm optimistic about how a family-friendly economic environment might be able to help. So I have to credit my colleague Lyman Stone, who's here today, for introducing me to this concept because it's really helpful. So, I want to introduce this idea of fertility gaps, which I already mentioned. The blue and purple lines here represent real fertility decline in Europe, North America, and Australia. You'll see it's measured in children per woman on the y-axis over here. And the red dots represent averages of surveys that capture ideal family size among women of childbearing age, usually. Um, you'll see that the red dots cluster around about two and a half, little below 2.5 children per woman in 2020, while the real fertility, again, like Lynn already mentioned, is below that replacement rate of 2.1. So adding an arrow here identifying the gap between average fertility preferences, which, like I said, are remaining pretty stable around between 2 and 3 children, and then total fertility rates, which are now nearly ubiquitously below 2 children per woman in the developed world. So this arrow is kind of what I'm referring to as the fertility gap there. In the United States, we have collected this data at the state level and find a fertility gap, an average fertility gap of 0.76 children between that ideal family size and then actual total fertility rate in each state. It's as high as 1.11 here in New Hampshire and as low as 0.33 in North Dakota. The variation here implies that there are some policy environments that are relatively better or worse places for women to reach their fertility goals. So that's kind of the takeaway here. So, of course, you're going to have limits on how successful you can meet any of your goals or dreams, right? Life happens, unexpected things happen. But the fact that we have so much variation at the state level in how large this fertility gap is shows us that there is a role for public policy, and that certain environments are more conducive to family formation than others. So the fertility gap is a really helpful metric also because it naturally holds constant all the other traits that go into fertility preferences. So it doesn't ask why someone wants three children or one or even zero, but only if the average woman is reaching her ideal. So it helps us to kind of isolate a lot of the noise around fertility. As mentioned earlier, we know that less regulation or more economic freedom is associated with smaller fertility gaps in the US. An economic freedom index would include measures of taxes and government spending, regulations on business, and labor market policies, which I'm sure we'll hear about from Susannah today. Um, in a recent study I was part of, we decided to isolate the childcare industry just to see if variation in state regulations affected family size outcomes. So here you'll see on the screen an index score for New York. They received a childcare freedom score of 1.87 out of 10. And that's a pretty low score, which puts them at 49th out of 50. Now, something New York, of course, has done is tried to subsidize childcare to try to match, okay, if we're going to have really strict kind of regulatory environment around childcare, well, then that's going to be more expensive. So then we have to also inject some money into the childcare space, right, to make this affordable. Um, but it's interesting because we can see again, not only are we talking about economic freedom broadly, but specific industries and how they regulate business to potentially, obviously affect affordability, but also things like flexibility that are going to have a really big effect on how families can achieve their fertility goals, right? To find compatibility between work life and family life. So after controlling for income, education, religion, marriage rates, parental child care time, and many other factors, we found that childcare freedom is associated with smaller fertility gaps. So you saw the state variation, and then obviously there's different scores for childcare regulation for each state. And this just means that women in less regulated states are reaching their fertility goals more successfully than states with less economic freedom, specifically relating to childcare. The reason for this is closely connected to labor market issues, right? Work-family compatibility. Childcare is a key piece of all the resources that enable women and men to successfully have a career and a family, which we know people care about today. So I want to talk about what's possible. Sorry, skipping that slide. Um, what's possible in the childcare space. So, we're already seeing a few glimpses of this in the US where the bulk of childcare is still provided by private childcare businesses. So if you're representing another country or working with another country, it's going to look different here. But I think the fact that the US still has some kind of private childcare market really shows us that, okay, maybe innovation is possible to be able to kind of speed up progress in this area, right? Obviously, it's a really labor-intensive industry, something that requires, one adult for every few kids, and that's going to be expensive. But there still are ways that progress can happen. So one thing is that employers are stepping up to provide employer-sponsored childcare, often on site at factories or headquarters of businesses. Bright Horizons is a company who contracts directly with employers to set up nearby childcare centers for employees' kids. And they actually have over 1,000 locations worldwide and over 700 in the US. Another way employers are adapting to the importance of childcare is through dependent care savings accounts. These allow employees to choose where their employers' contributions go, right? So we have employer contributions maybe to healthcare, 401k. But for example, in a two-parent family or two working parent family, the pressing needs might be, you know, more of those contributions to go toward today's problems instead of tomorrow's retirement account. And so dependent care savings accounts allow, some of those benefits to be redirected toward more pressing needs, more short-term needs related to childcare and even elder care, right? So talk about the generation that's sort of squeezed in the middle between caring for children and caring for elderly adults. Dependent care savings accounts can also go towards those expenses. Another thing is that internet use has enabled expansive networks of babysitters and nannies. These platforms facilitate background checks, oversee matching between providers and families, and provide a place for reviews and ratings to help other families find the right childcare provider. One of my favorite examples is that specialty preschools, such as those who offer multiple languages, spend most of their time in outdoor facilities or offer flexible hours, such as night shift care, are popping up to meet unique family needs. And these are more likely to be available in less regulated economies, right? Less regulated states that have higher scores on that childcare freedom index. Something to note is that the relationship between some of these regulations and really all of the regulations that we document in the index and quality is not settled in the literature. The thing that about quality is it's really about quality of interactions and relationships. And so some of these other private accreditation bodies, like I put on the screen, Association for Nature-Based Education, which a family member of mine works in that space, or this night care, new industry that's popping up for nurses or people who work the night shift. Um, you know, the fact that regulation is more flexible in states with more childcare freedom doesn't necessarily mean quality is worse, but it means that these new industries, these new ideas and creative solutions aren't going to be able to fit into that rigid regulatory framework for what the state has for decades, defined childcare to be. So that's what we mean by kind of childcare freedom, right? Freedom to introduce creative ideas, introduce new technologies, and hopefully scale up in a way that expands access and affordability. And also kind of, according to what people's preferences are, if they want their child to learn Spanish, in addition, to all the other things that kids do at preschool, then you may have more of those opportunities too with more childcare freedom. Okay, so moving to housing quickly. I've talked a lot about childcare and I'm hoping to extend kind of some of my research into housing. And so this is sort of a um, less settled and more just like something that inspires me that I thought might be able to inspire you all. But housing and fertility are obviously really important too, right? It's another piece of that work-family compatibility to be able to live in a place that's convenient and kind of central to all the different things going on in family and work life. Um, and while it's more difficult to measure, we expect that housing market to behave similarly to the childcare market. So a more flexible housing market should be able to better serve family needs. So here's a glimpse of what we know. First, housing markets um, are predictable pretty much. I mean, they're complex, but they're shaping fertility in kind of predictable ways. So Dedling and Carney here show us that rising house prices reduce fertility for renters while increasing it for homeowners through wealth effects, right? Something kind of predictable. If you're benefiting from those rising house prices, then, you may be able to feel like you can afford another child. If you're still kind of out of the housing market and renting, then rising house prices aren't a positive for you and your family. A couple of other authors reinforce that any fertility gains, um, you know, are are concentrated among homeowners. So, um, you know, being priced out of that homeowner position is really, for a lot of people in their head, pricing them out of parenthood. So that's why I wanted to talk about it and work on it more. But another piece here is like price to income ratio, which is just another way to say affordability. This is what really matters more than raw price levels. So if you're looking at cities and saying, oh my goodness, it's so expensive in X city or New York. Well, yes, you can say it's a city, but other cities might actually have a better price to income ratio and more affordability, even though it is an urban area, and that's determined by the policy environment. Um, Across countries, we see, you know, people delaying homeownership and delaying fertility accordingly. And then also, there's a great paper on relocation. So, because people are relocating to pursue homeownership, that is like a, several year delay in their family formation, right? So, this is work by Leah Platt, Boston, and co-authors showing just high housing costs pushing families to relocate rather than form households in expensive areas. So that's shifting when and where births occur and often delaying them. So really, in effect, barriers to entering the housing market are barriers to starting a family, just like barriers to finding a good childcare scenario that you feel comfortable with, um, is a barrier, kind of a mental block to being able to take that step to start a family or grow your family. So the most common housing regulations that affect kind of a flexible housing market are zoning restrictions, parking minimums, lengthy permitting processes that just make building take forever, development fees discouraging new housing developments, and strict building codes. Perhaps, um, making it harder to build multifamily homes. So these zoning rules like single family mandates and height limits directly cap how much housing can be built. Things like parking requirements and fees raise costs and make projects less viable on a given plot of land. And then delays and uncertainty in the approval process just discourage these projects from expanding. And a lot of times the newer, housing developments are going to be more energy efficient, they're going to be taking into account the needs of families in ways that are congruence with new technologies that we have today. We have evidence from economists like Edward Glaser and Joseph Gorko showing that regulation makes the housing supply less elastic to or less responsive to demand. Just, okay, if a city is growing, then regulations are going to be the thing that get in the way of the housing supply in that city being able to respond to the influx of population. Fortunately, we have some natural experiments to draw upon. So Auckland, New Zealand, Minneapolis, and Tokyo have tried some zoning reforms to address housing prices that I'll highlight. In Auckland, there was a 2016 reform that represents just a really large scale upzoning reform, which upzoning, excuse me, is allowing multifamily housing across much of the city instead of kind of just single family housing and sharply relaxing density limits, which would be something like minimum lot size. Economists that have studied this reform with difference and differences showed that rents fell by roughly 26 to 33% and house prices by about 21% relative to their counterfactual paths using like other similar cities who didn't have these reforms. Construction activity increased substantially in these upzoned areas. So again, remove the regulation, you see a response to demand. And that didn't happen in the neighborhoods that didn't benefit from the upzoning reform. So we remove binding zoning constraints, allow housing supply to expand, and ease some of those price pressures. Again, this hasn't been directly linked to fertility, but you can just see how in an urban area where both parents are working, and these urban centers that are attracting families, this is going to make a big difference for timing of that first child or second child. And that's what we see when we look at housing subsidies and these kind of academic research projects on, okay, we know what would happen if housing prices rise, that's going to delay fertility or suppress it. What if we give people money? Or, there was a Brazilian study about a housing lottery, right? You got a subsidized mortgage in a lottery system in Brazil. Well, among the families that won the housing lottery, they, maybe didn't have more births overall, but they did have those children sooner. than their counterparts who didn't win the housing lottery. And when we think about fertility gaps, we know that timing, is part of that. And so if you can even move up those first and second births, that may allow for higher overall fertility, just based on the timing. Another one is Minneapolis. So Minneapolis became the first major US city to eliminate single family zoning. It was approved in 2018 and implemented starting in 2020. It mainly legalized duplexes and triplexes citywide instead of just single family homes. So early empirical work that we have on this reform is finding that housing prices and rents are rising more slowly than other comparable cities, right? So estimated to be about 15 to 30% lower than they would have been without the reform. So this is an instance of kind of addressing that missing middle that I've heard about in some of these housing studies, meaning, okay, you have single family homes, you have apartment complexes, maybe in high-rise buildings, but what about the people that want to start a family and want kind of that single family home feel, but can't afford to go fully single family home? That's where the duplexes, triplexes, um, and even kind of um, other kind of allowing people to basically build like an apartment in their backyard, a garage apartment or something like that for in-laws or something like that would address a missing middle between full single family home, super expensive, and then living in a high rise. And this one's early on, so we'll see what happens as the supply responds. And then Tokyo is an older example, but Tokyo's housing system was really shaped by the 1968 City Planning Act, which created a national flexible zoning framework. So it's really different than the US case. Zoning is centralized in the US, zoning is centralized differently in the US. And in Tokyo, it's broadly permissive, allowing housing in most zones and limiting local barriers. So you get permission from like higher levels of government rather than the local government, so that um, basically interested parties at the local level have less power to like block something that they don't like, that would maybe make their life more difficult, right? So if it's happening at the higher level, then they're saying, oh, yeah, this is a good thing for overall housing supply and not just, oh, well, this one developer doesn't want the other developer to get a permit because that would, make him have to lower his prices. So that's been the approach Japan has taken, which is pretty interesting. Um, and it's enabled pretty much continuous construction and um, rapid responses to new demands for more housing in Tokyo. So their housing market has been pretty stable, even under higher demand in terms of prices. So you can expect more stable housing prices, even no matter what happens with population, if you're allowing flexibility among permitting and zoning and things like that. I also have another anecdote that I recently heard about, which is a new high-rise housing project on Indigenous reserve land in Ontario, or sorry, in Vancouver. Um, so it's like a 10 square miles, space in Vancouver that has been given back to the Squamish Nation, and none of the regulations apply to them. So they have built like 6 high-rise apartments in the middle of Vancouver, and are totally addressing a huge housing shortage very quickly with these buildings. They're energy efficient, they're, beautiful. And of course, getting a lot of pushback at the local level from people who don't want high rises in their backyards. But still, it's a interesting case study of what would happen without some of these restrictive rules slowing down building, because this particular group of people just got to bypass all of that, and they are addressing a housing shortage very swiftly. Yeah, so the most effective housing reforms really just focus on removing constraints that limit supply. This is going to help families find a good fit for growing their family, right? So legalizing higher density housing by eliminating things like parking mandates, having to have a certain amount of parking spaces per unit, shifting approval processes, are all just ideas to help expand that missing middle of families who might be wanting to make, or couples, individuals that might be wanting to make the transition to family life, and then allow more responsiveness to demand. So that's what I have. Would love to discuss any more ideas and insights you have on barriers to parenthood. Thank you.
Excellent, Anna Claire. Boy, that you really, well, it's very encouraging that one solution is innovation.
Yeah.
Reduce regulation, let human beings solve problems we share in terms of our low fertility. Yeah, it's encouraging. One thing I think of, and as an older person, I could say this. One problem is there are a lot of us that raise our children in our houses, and now our houses we're very comfortable, and but if we stay in them, there's less, single houses for families that maybe want to move on to a bigger family. So I don't know. It's kind of raising a consciousness of how important helping couples have children and have places to have children. Um,
Yeah, well, hopefully there will be new parts of town, new places that become the place to have a family, right? So you don't
right,
necessarily have to
right,
leave, but we do need to see those places developing and becoming, an attractive setting for raising children.
right. And also the duplexes, and not everybody wants to live with their parents, but it
Hmm.
might help the childcare situation. Um, And the elder care situation. So
Hmm.
if we become creative in terms of that, again, that's really supporting, underlining how important family is. So, um, yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I wanted to congratulate you for your passing your defense too.
Thank you.
So, I guess that's my question. Thank you. Very, very good. Okay, next I will introduce Suzanne Pettit. Um, she is the Associate Director of the Strengthening Families Research Initiative at the University of Notre Dame, where her work focuses on family well-being and women's economic mobility. Prior to Notre Dame, she worked in policy analysis, advising state and federal policymakers on policies to expand economic opportunity for women and families. Her talk is going to be, does flexible work support family formation, evidence and implications? Um, She's done a lot of work, and a lot of it is surveying the evidence on how work arrangements affect fertility. And she's going to share with us policymakers have to support working mothers and non-traditional workers. Again, another important topic. We are so grateful to have you, Suzanne. You have the floor.
Great. Sorry, I couldn't find the button to turn my mic on. I'm very excited to be here and very thankful to have the opportunity to get to present some really exciting research on flexible work. As Lynn mentioned, I am the Associate Director of the Strengthening Families Research Initiative here at the University of Notre Dame. We are a new initiative focused on finding ways to promote family formation and family stability and looking at the economic, social, and policy implications for declining fertility, declining marriage, and ways that we can support families of all shapes and sizes. So, to begin with a brief history lesson, working mothers are not a modern phenomenon. Mothers have always worked in some capacity or another. It's just depended on what that shape looks like. Nobel laureate in economics, Claudia Golden, coined this U-shaped curve, and I really love this graphic that shows married women's labor force participation from 1790 to the 1970s. And if, as you can see on the graph, participation started very high in agrarian economies where women had to work alongside their families on the farms. And then married women's labor force participation did collapse towards the rise of industrialization. Industrial jobs and factory jobs were not necessarily compatible with home life. The women who were working in those jobs were generally very poor. And so there was a shift downwards in women's economic or women's labor force participation. But as society got richer and over time, and we moved towards a service industry, service-driven economy, women re-entered the labor force. Some of that combines with access to education, changing expectations about women's work inside and outside the home, and also access to the contraceptive pill. But all of this together, I think, underscores that women's work is the norm. Every era since the 1790s, when this was started to be tracked, is that women have worked, and every era has just reshaped how and where they work, not if they work. The changing nature of work that has been occurring for centuries, but changes since the pandemic have been especially beneficial for mothers, and we can see that through the literature I'm going to discuss today. To situate ourselves within this broader conversation about fertility declines, I want to highlight some new research from my colleagues Melissa Carney and Phil Levine that show that the decline in fertility is not concentrated in any one group. The evidence from high-income countries points to a broad cohort-wide shift away from marriage and childbearing among today's young adults. As careers, consumption, travel, and personal development has become more central, having children has become one option among many instead of a default expectation for adults in their 20s and 30s. And this is happening around the same time as norms around parenting have changed. So parenting is now much more intensive. There's greater expectations on parents about what they're supposed to provide for their children. And then there's also been shifts in traditional gender roles that have made the decision, especially for women, to opt out to feel more reasonable. I'm really glad Anna Claire talked about the fertility gap because that is a big motivator behind my presentation as well. I won't belabor that point again because Anna Claire did such a great job laying it out. But again, this growing gap between desired and realized fertility is really important because that indicates that there's some sort of structural barrier between adults feeling like the number of children they want to have fits within their conception of a good life, whether that's access to housing, childcare, or work arrangements that I will be talking about. To make this a bit more concrete, I want to point out more data from Carney and Levine looking at declines in fertility in the US. So levels differ in the decline in fertility and the rise in childlessness between education groups, and college-educated women can indeed are likely to have fewer children, are more likely to be childless, and are more likely to be married. But the changes over time in these outcomes has been proportionate. So the decline in marriage or the decline in childbearing has been the same, relatively the same between education cohorts. So fertility is lower and childlessness is higher among young women today than women of the same age 10 to 15 years ago. So my older cousins who are about 10 to 15 years older than me, I am more likely to have lower fertility and to be childless than they are, regardless of any differences in our educational attainment. So this kind of debunks the common claim that fertility decline might be driven by one socioeconomic group. Flexible work can serve as a very important mechanism to changing these structural barriers. I'm going to focus today on if the shape of work makes it easier or harder to combine work with family. The evidence I'm going to walk through suggests that meaningful changes in how work is structured can have very important effects on both maternal labor force participation and family formation. A few caveats. I'm not saying that flexible work is a silver bullet to increase fertility and that if everyone worked from home, our birth rate would bounce back up to 2.1, or that it should be a complete substitute for these other family supports that Anna Claire and Lyman have and will discuss. But I'm saying that pro-family interventions work better when they focus on reconciling work and home rather than trying to pit those against each other or force women to choose between their fertility and professional goals. And flexibility is one of the most direct levers we have for doing that. Because of constraints within the literature, most of my discussion will focus on mothers and is very Eurocentric. Where I can expand the scope, I have tried to do so, but I wanted to give that warning up front. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a great natural experiment for economists to study what happens when work arrangements change. As we all know, overnight work arrangements changed from in an office, typical 9 to 5, to very flexible working from home. Even jobs that never would have conceived of allowing for flexibility had to work from home. Now, for some people, this was really great. Mothers experienced a unique cost to the shift away from the office. Around 2 million mothers left the workforce in 2020 globally, but that wasn't distributed evenly across different types of work arrangements. Mothers who had access to flexible work fared better after the pandemic and were able to persist in the labor force. In the United States, the data on women persisting in the labor force due to flexibility is really striking. As schools and childcare centers reopened and remote work remained available, maternal labor force participation and prime-age women's labor force participation rebounded to a near record high at about 77%, and nearly 1 million more working mothers were working by the end of 2022. So there's this really strong bounce back of women aged 25 to 44 and mothers of children working by the end of 2022. But new data that came out at the beginning of last year showed that as businesses have pushed for return to office, maternal labor force participation has started to fall back down. In the US, maternal labor force participation among young women dropped nearly 3% in the first half of 2025 alone, hitting its lowest point since that 2022 bump, which shows that flexible work increases the work opportunities for mothers, and I'll show some survey data that supports that point directly later in the presentation. To better understand why this flexibility is so important, I think it's important to first understand constraints that mothers are facing. The motherhood penalty, or the reduction in earnings or career advancement that occur immediately after childbirth, and the divergence in or women experience a large divergence in their income and their career opportunities immediately after childbirth compared to men. Some of this is a question of choice. You can think of a lawyer who maybe prior to pregnancy and giving birth was working in an intense job that required her to work about 60 hours per week. And then she chose to transition to a smaller firm where she got paid less, but worked more traditional hours. Of course, some of this motherhood penalty is due to discrimination, but a lot of it can be controlled by factors of choice. Women also take on a disproportionate share of caregiving and housework. Even when women are the primary breadwinners, they spend more time with their children and spend more time on caregiving than their husbands. But the research shows that flexibility eases these trade-offs. So in occupations and sectors that are more friendly to flexible work, women see smaller motherhood penalties. This paper by Bertrand et al. Found that they almost disappear when women have access to more flexible work arrangements. Motherhood penalties quickly palliate. And then flexibility also allowed mothers during the pandemic to feel that they could better balance their requirements at work and at home. Importantly, this desire for flexible work and the need for flexible work for many mothers is not something that just exists in the abstract. It's a demonstrated preference by mothers. The majority of mothers who exited the workforce after becoming a parent did do so because they wanted to stay home. But the second highest reason cited is because their job was inflexible. So 36% of mothers said that they left the workforce because their job was not flexible enough. So flexibility can be considered a sort of precondition for mothers' labor force participation. Survey data continually reinforces this. 62% of stay-at-home mothers say they would need work flexibility to return to work. 29% of respondents said they would take a pay cut. 21% said they would forfeit vacation time. 15% said they'd give up employer matching contributions. All of this shows that the constraint of inflexible jobs are binding on women. Women's ability or choice or desire to give up some of these fringe benefits for the sake of flexibility shows how much many women value access to flexible work arrangements. Now that we've established that flexibility can help increase mothers' labor force participation, I want to focus towards the main topic of conversation for this discussion, which is family formation. Now, the evidence suggests that flexibility isn't only valuable because it helps mothers stay in the workplace, but it can encourage them to have children and achieve their fertility goals. Going back to the natural experiment of the pandemic, what the pandemic showed us is what could happen if women who might not otherwise have had access to flexible work arrangements were able to work from home. In California, fertility rates for young women under 25 who were highly educated and also first-time moms had a slight baby boom. Those women who would kind of statistically be unlikely to choose to have a first child, when they had access to remote work, chose to do so. And overall fertility in California rose by 5.1% during the pandemic than prior to the pandemic. In Norway, researchers found that the pandemic spurred a 10% increase in births among women, and this was concentrated among women with formerly inflexible jobs. Now, in the qualitative data that backs up both of these studies, women cite their ability to reconcile work and home more easily due to remote work as the reason they decided to have children. Some of the more direct evidence on flexibility outside of COVID comes from two very different contexts. The first is a very recent study from Stanford University that estimates that when both parents work from home only 1 day per week, lifetime fertility is greater by 0.32 children per woman, which might seem a bit small, but to put it in the context of the broader estimates in the paper, the same study estimates that work from home accounts for roughly 8% of US fertility, which is a contribution greater than spending on early childcare and education. So clearly there's a lot of power to remote work to boost fertility. Now, the second is a company level example I think is so interesting from Japan, a country where the fertility rate is only 1.15. The Itochu Corporation introduced these work style reforms that prioritize schedule flexibility, and the fertility rate among female employees rose from 0.94 in 2010 to 1.97 in 2021, which again, this is against a national average of 1.15. So this flexible work arrangement did have a lot of power in this context. Now, while operating within very different contexts, both of these studies these examples indicate that work from home and flexibility over working hours can have a meaningful increase in lifetime fertility. The final area of the literature I want to discuss is how flexible work can change fertility intentions. Two recent studies, one in Italy and Singapore, use different survey methods to see how the potential for workplace flexibility can shape people's plans to have children. In Italy, where the fertility rate is 1.2, mothers with access to flexible work arrangements are 6 percentage points more likely to have another child. So if a child has one, then they have access to flexible work. Mothers are 6 percentage points more likely to say, I want to have baby number 2. Whereas childless men who were given the choice of a flexible work arrangement were 5 percentage points more likely to intend to have a child. So this is that power for both men and women. Now in Singapore, where the fertility rate is 0.87, a randomized experiment that gave young unmarried workers access to different work scenarios, some of which were fully in the office, some which were fully remote, some in between. When workers were presented with scenarios with schedule flexibility, so the ability to kind of choose your own hours, and remote work opportunities, where these were the default, women had 66 to 79% higher odds of expressing intentions to have children within 5 years. These survey results are definitely more conceptual. They are not causal like some of the previous results, but they point in that same direction, that flexibility can meaningfully change the way people think about family formation and whether or not to have children. All of this evidence shows that flexible work and labor policy should be an important part of any pro-family policy toolkit. Before I close and give some of the implications for policy, I want to make one point that often gets missed in these conversations, that flexible work doesn't necessarily have to come from employer policy, although employers are an important agent in this debate or in this fight for flexible work. But flexibility can also come from the structure of the labor market. Gig work, independent contracting, and self-employment are all crucial pathways to flexibility, especially for moms. Data shows that self-employment is more common among mothers of young children, and those mothers tend to spend more time with their children, about 2 hours per day on average, when they are able to be self-employed. Now, this can range from someone being a driver for Uber or Lyft, or delivering groceries with Shipt, or Uber Eats or some other delivery service, to being an independent contractor running your own copywriting business. There's a wide range of what these jobs can look like. But these types of employments are more common among mothers, and those women who work in independent contracting jobs are more likely than traditional employees to have children. Now, this is an important example because it shows that mothers are voting with their feet when it comes to the labor force and building flexibility outside of traditional employment in order to better meet their needs, both economically with the need for maybe a supplemental income, but also their needs at home. This is really important and should inform how we think about what pro-family labor policy should look like. Flexibility needs to come from employers, but it also should come from a dynamic labor market. Rigid labor markets that prioritize job protection and structured wage and promotion over job diversity can constrain the dynamism of the labor market, which is bad for all workers in the economy, but it may also unintentionally constrain fertility, especially among young adults. A lot of these job protection policies and wage and promotion laws benefit older employees, incumbent employees, over younger adults entering the workforce. And so again, we can see how these types of policies may reduce fertility among young adults. So pro-family labor policy should be focusing on expanding the menu of viable work arrangements. To summarize what we went over today, the body of research that I talked about has established 3 key points. The first is that the compatibility of work and family is shaped by labor market structures and policy. 2, flexibility is the demonstrated preference of mothers. Mothers prefer to have flexible work arrangements, and when their flexibility is threatened or taken away, mothers tend to leave the workforce. And where flexibility is available, family formation follows. Flexibility doesn't just help mothers stay employed, it helps them form families and achieve their fertility goals. The shape of work shapes the family, and research supports this claim consistently across countries and methods. Labor policy and family policy have long been treated as separate domains, but this evidence suggests that they really should go hand in hand. And how we structure work is one of the most important levers we have for supporting family formation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susannah. Boy, you are very convincing that flexible work hours and remote work is really good for fertility. I liked also a comment you made that it allows parents to have actually more time with their children, which of course is very important for child development. One question is, how do you argue with the problem that it may cause for employees? How do you, what kind of benefits can you tell employers that it's good for them to be flexible in work hours?
Yeah, there's definitely a question of productivity. And so I think some of that comes from people posting on social media and saying, they have something set up so that their Teams doesn't turn from green to yellow, that they seem like they're working when they really aren't. But the data doesn't support that happening at a wide scale, especially for mothers. So mothers tend to be equally as productive, if not more productive, when they have access to work from home arrangements. Most workers, it's about the same when they're working from home or have access to remote work. And I think it's important to say that this isn't necessarily working from home 5 days a week, but just access to maybe the ability to come in at 7 and leave at 3 so you can be there for school drop-off. That's another form of kind of pronatal flexible work, flexibility over hours, when you work and where you work are all important.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, to me, we really need to create a family-centered culture, and both of you ladies have really stated how we can go that way and why it needed. So thank you, Susannah. It was very
Of
good.
course. Thank
Um,
you.
okay, next I have the great honor of having Lyman Stone present. Let me introduce him. He is a senior fellow and director of the Pronatalism Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies. He is also the director of research at the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence. He earned a PhD recently in sociology at McGill University with of course, population dynamics specialization. His work has been covered widespread, New York Times, Washington Post, Journal, Wall Street Journal. Um, and we have a special relationship to Lyman. He has advised us for several years on our side event at the UN on demographics, and he has presented for us at the UN side events and several other opportunities. So we're really blessed to have you, Lyman. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. Let me share my PowerPoint here. So I've got that up. So we've heard about a lot of different policies today. We've heard about housing policy, which is extremely important. We've heard about workforce and employment and labor force policy, which is extremely important. I guess I should go to actual presenter mode here, shouldn't I? What I'm going to talk about is cash. Now, the reason that I'm going to talk about cash, and what I mean by cash is benefits that are given to families because they had kids, and it ends up with money going into their bank account. So free childcare, I'm not studying here because that's not money into their bank account. So getting money for having kids. The reason to study is because a lot of countries do it. A lot of countries are interested in it, and because it is kind of the final litmus test of everything we're talking about. If we say, well, we should do remote work, we should do housing, all these different things, these all rest on a shared theory that basically, if we alleviate the material costs of having children, people will have more of them, right? We need to build more housing so housing is more accessible and affordable. We need to ease labor force difficulties so that people can have the income that comes from work while also raising children, right? So they don't have to have, be in two places at once to do those things, and they don't have to sacrifice that income. All of these theories are basically based on the idea that material costs are a really important regulatory factor shaping fertility behavior. If this is true, then giving people money to have kids should work, right? It should be the case that there is some price tag. Maybe it's a very high number, but there should be some number at which you can just pay people to have kids. It might not be a good idea to do, but there should be a number. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the evidence that we have on this question, what it tells us about the role of material costs and material incentives in having kids. So part of the motivation here is definitely cash incentives have a reputation for failing. So a good example here is Korea. We can see that Korea's total fertility rate, that's the blue line, is kind of in steady decline, but their family policy spending as a percentage of GDP seems to just go up and up. If you kind of squint, you might imagine here that the slope of the family policy spending line is kind of related to the slope of the TFR line. You might do like a second derivative there, but by and large, this is not what you would expect to see if cash grants are really in the driver's seat of fertility, right? Okay. So to start with, we have kind of a pessimistic case. People often say, well, Hungary has done all these things. Why doesn't Hungary have much higher fertility? I'm happy to talk about Hungary in Q&A if people want, but I'm not going to talk about it in this presentation because there aren't actually very many studies of it. And what I'm going to do is present you some results from a meta-analysis of cash benefits for children. So a meta-analysis, for those unfamiliar, is where I'm not going and doing my own new study of a benefit. I am looking for every single study of benefit programs that I can find. So places where somebody else studied how some cash benefit influenced fertility. And I am taking their effect estimates and I am putting them to a standardized format so we can say, okay, empirically, what is the typical finding in this literature? If we were to pool all our different studies together, what would they tell us is the average effect, basically? So I'm looking at studies that study a program that had some actual transfer of money for having kids in some quantifiable amount. That is, I was able to find an estimate of how much money the families were actually getting for their kids. And the study actually studied fertility outcomes, not marriage outcomes, not contraceptive usage outcomes, fertility outcomes. The classic case, like the most heavily cited paper in this literature, is one from 2005 studying a baby bonus in Quebec, which a baby bonus is just like a one-time cash grant. But there are a lot of these, and it found that there was an effect. And so we're going to try and look at all of these studies. There's 54 in this. Since making this PowerPoint, I've become aware of 2 more. There's always new ones being published, but there's a fair number of these studies, not tons, but there's a fair number. So to do this, I had to create standardized estimates. We want to fully standardize the kinds of estimates we get. So what we want to know is, imagine you are a policymaker and you have a fixed budget, and you want to know how many babies can I get for that much money, right? So this is a simple calculation. In principle, the papers, they almost always tell us the percentage change in some fertility measure, total fertility rate, cohort fertility rate, crude birth rate, some kind of measure. And usually we know the size of the program. Like we know, they raised the child tax credit by $500, or they raised the wage replacement rate for maternity leave by 8% or something like that. Or if the paper doesn't say it, I can look it up. So generally speaking, it's not too hard to find the benefit size. The tricky part is making them equivalent. So you can imagine a $500 benefit to have a kid in India is very different than a $500 benefit in the United States, right? In the US, we say, $500, who cares? In India, $500 is a lot of money. So what we want to do is and we also have the problem that sometimes you have a program that's like, we'll give you $500 right now and nothing else. But some programs create long-term benefits, right? A child allowance that gives you $500 every year is worth a lot more than a baby bonus that gives you $500 right now. So we want to create a standardized measure. So it's going to be the present discounted value. That's basically, we take into account the fact that money in the future is less valuable to people than money today. And we're trying to sum up the current value of future payments from programs. Then we're going to divide it by family income. Many studies just tell us the family income. They say, the income of families that got this benefit was, $27,000 or whatever. For studies that don't tell us that, I use GDP per capita at the time of the intervention as a substitute. It's not a perfect substitute, but this gives us the present value of the program as a percent of income. So then we want to calculate the actual benefit for the program. That was the cost calculation. Now the benefit calculation is just the percentage change in the author's reported fertility indicator, and I'll come to those in a bit. And then our target outcome is, how much does fertility change in response to a program of a given size, a given expense, okay? So what I'm specifically going to do is I'm going to standardize all the effects, and we're going to say, based on this study's reported effect sizes and costs, for every study in the literature, how would fertility rise? What percent would it rise if a benefit with a net present value of 25% of income were implemented? So just to give you a perspective on what that means. If we increase the child tax credit in the US by $3,000, so we raised it from $2,200 to $5,200, accounting for eligibility rules, that would be a benefit change with a net present value of about 25% of GDP per capita. Okay, so when I say what kind of policy are we talking about? We're talking about making the child tax credit $5,000, basically. Okay, or this would be a one-time baby bonus given to all people in the US worth about $24,000. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. How much would that type of policy, say in the US, change fertility? The pooled answer from 150 different effect estimates, over 50 studies, is that benefit would raise fertility about 6.5 to 10%. Okay. Now, that's not that much. 6.5 to 10%, that's not that much. That's, we'd spend hundreds of billions of dollars to raise fertility from 1.6 to 1.63. Okay, so no, to 1.7, something like that, right? So this is not a huge effect, but it is an effect in the 6.5 to 10% range. That's like the confidence interval here from all the studies. But let me show you this in more detail. So here we're just looking at recurring allowances. So these are places where governments change the generosity of some kind of program that gave people like a monthly or an annual payment. Okay. What you can see is there's a lot of variation in the effect. So this paper, Brainerd and Malkova, it's a recent paper looking at a change in Romanian benefits in the 1990s and 2000s. It finds a big effect. Then on the other hand, we have this paper, Parent and Wang, 2007, that shows this like negative effect of increasing people's benefits. I'll tell you, Parent and Wang, this paper is erroneous, but for good scientific ethics, I can't just exclude it because I think it's incorrect. But we have all these papers, okay, that are studying basically like child allowances. And in all but one case, they find a positive effect. Sometimes it's significant, sometimes it's not. And if we pool it all, we find an effect of 2 to 6%. That is, a 25% net present value child allowance increases fertility by 2 to 6%. That's not a huge effect. It is an effect, but it's not huge. What if we go to one-time baby bonuses? This is not a child allowance. We're just going to give you a chunk of money right when the baby's born. You can see the effect estimates are all positive, except there is this one crazy, noisy one, PAR 2011. That's a study of a case in Australia. You can see that there's a lot of noise here, but again, all positive estimates. And if we pool them, we end up with a pooled estimate for baby bonuses of 9 to 18%. That is, if you increase the benefit by 25% of, if you gave a baby bonus worth 25% of GDP per capita, fertility could rise 9 to 18%. Wow, that's actually like kind of a significant increase, right? If we're talking about like a 15% increase, that's like we'd go from 1.6 to 1.8 or something like that. That's a significant increase in fertility. Then we have some studies of maternity pay and tax benefits. There's 2 studies of maternity wage replacement. They're noisy, but they show 3 to 15% as the range of benefits. And then studies of tax benefits, it's like child tax credit and things like that, show effects ranging from -1% to 8%. So tax benefits probably don't work very well. So I said we're like studying a bigger child tax credit, but like really the child tax credit might actually be a really bad way to encourage fertility, possibly. Though none of these, actually one of these is a study of US child tax benefits. Whittington et al. 1990 is a study of US tax benefits. And you can see it does have a big effect, but it's a very old study. So if we pool these and we look at them in comparison, we can see that baby bonuses have the biggest effect. Maternity pay is next, and then allowances and tax benefits. Now, the standard errors mostly overlap, so I wouldn't say these are like super high confidence differences. But what we can say is, generally speaking, pronatal policy works. That is, if you throw money at the problem, you do get more babies. It works the best if you give money right away to parents. Baby bonuses are right away. Maternity pay is usually in the first 6 months or year of the child's life. If you give people money right away, they respond more. And remember, I've already accounted for discount rates here. So it's not just that like, a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. That's not the dynamic here. What's really going on is politicians are cheats and liars, and parents know that. And so a parent says, well, a baby bonus, I get the money right now, right? So I've got it. I don't have to worry what the law next year will say, but a child allowance or a tax benefit, that happens over the kid's whole life. Do you really trust that the government's never going to take it away? Probably not. And I can say when none of these studies explore that particular mechanism, but I can tell you that having done focus groups with reproductive age women on exactly this question, this is a very real concern parents have, as they say, well, you say I'm getting this benefit, but you're just going to take it away at some point because I know it's expensive. The government's in debt. You're not going to be able to pay for it forever. I guess people fundamentally believe in Ricardian equivalence, which is when it comes to family benefits, which is kind of shocking to find in the wild. But then we can look at effects by parity. Parity is birth order. A lot of people believe that kids are cheaper by the dozen. And that's true. Kids are cheaper. The marginal kid is cheaper. But I find that actually cash benefits have the biggest effect on first births. Now, there's a couple reasons this might be. One, first births happen to younger people who are just more likely to be reproductive age. They're more likely to be in that range. And also they're poorer. So it's possible that just the real kind of as a percentage of income, a giving cash benefit is more beneficial to somebody at a first birth. But there's another reason for this. I assume probably a lot of people listening have read Hannah's Children. It's this book that Catherine Pacolic wrote. It's a wonderful book about the experiences of highly educated women who choose to have a lot of kids. And what's interesting about it is these women with a lot of kids, they almost all say money didn't matter. I'm just having kids because God wills it, or because I just love kids, or because, I just, all these intrinsic reasons. And the point is, the higher up in the birth order you go, the more of the women who are exposed to that parity progression are women who really don't care about material incentives, right? So women who are considering having a fifth kid, and notice that's third or higher births, women who are considering having a fifth kid, well, they already have 4 kids. If you already have 4 kids, you're already probably very intrinsically motivated to have kids. And so a slightly bigger cash benefit you don't really care about, okay? So in general, what's going on is people considering a first birth are just more selected on people who have weaker intrinsic motivations to have kids, whereas people having higher order births are more likely to be people who just intrinsically want kids. And this is a way of saying that religion can make policy cheaper for governments. So if you have religious minorities who deeply value having kids, then maybe you don't need to help them very much. Just give money to your secular groups. And I know that sounds very discriminatory, and it is, but in principle, it just is true that the Amish are going to have kids no matter what the child tax credit is. And so you don't really need to worry about what shapes Amish fertility. You need to figure out who's not having kids and what shapes their behavior. And it might be that all the people having lots of kids are not influenced by financial incentives, but the people you need to worry about are the people not having lots of kids. So you can see, those lines go down, suggesting that higher order births are less sensitive to cash incentives. Also, here is by income level. People often believe that low-income people are more sensitive to cash benefits. I find the opposite. They are less sensitive. Now, there's a caveat here. By socioeconomic status, I am adjusting benefit size for the group's income. So, in principle, what I'm saying is not if I give you $2,000, rich people will increase their fertility more than poor people. I'm saying if I give you 25% of your income, if I give rich people 25% of their income, that's a lot more expensive than giving poor people 25% of their income. If we equalize these to a common dollar value, we find that the elasticities are about identical. That is, that rich and poor people have about the same response to a fixed dollar benefit, but that as a percentage of income, rich people are more responsive when a benefit is a given percentage of their income. Now, there's reasons for this. a lot of poor people don't know how to, or can't claim benefits they might be technically eligible for. In the US, one of our biggest quote unquote pronatal programs is the additional earned income tax credit amount for single parents having kids. If you're a single parent, you have kids, you get a bigger EITC. Or if you're a married parent, you have kids, you get a bigger EITC if you're in the range for it. And yet we know that something like 30 to 40% of eligible EITC benefits will never be claimed. Why? Because a lot of poor people don't file taxes. They don't know how to. They don't realize they're eligible. So a lot of lower income people might technically be eligible for these super generous benefits, but various administrative barriers make it very difficult for them to claim them. Whereas high income people are going to claim every single benefit they're possibly eligible for, and then some. So also I should mention, on these graphs, I'm showing one set of bars on the left. That's just all studies. And then the right set of bars, I've limited to studies that have very high quality methods for causal inference. Okay, so that's these two sets of bars here. So the right bars are the ones that if you're kind of a skeptic of study quality here, you should look at the right bars. And you'll notice they're really not different. So yeah, you might wonder why lower socioeconomic status people are less responsive, and it's the reasons I gave. One is because we're adjusting the dollar amount here for the group's income, and second, because they might not claim benefits they're eligible for. Then we can look at effects by duration. Now, what I mean by duration is some policies might cause people to have babies, but it might just cause them to pull forward babies they would have had anyway, right? So you can imagine that a baby bonus might cause people to be like, oh, well, I wanted to have a baby. I better do it now while this policy is in effect, because politicians are liars and cheats. And I bet they're going to repeal this policy 2 years from now. Okay. You can very easily imagine that happening. And so that does happen. Now, so if we look at all of our studies combined, we see that all durations have this effect. Short run effects, so that's where we're not trying to control for that time shift effect, is even bigger. In long run effects, oh no, they're not distinguishable from zero. Uh-oh. So that would tell us that everything we're doing here with all this money is just shifting the timing of births. Now, I'm going to explain that's not what's going on in a second, but I will say, even if all we did is shift the timing of births, that's actually still a win for governments. If you compress generational width in a society where everybody has 2 kids, imagine 2 societies. Everyone has 2 kids in both of them. In one of them, they have 2 kids when they're 20. In the other, they have 2 kids when they're 30. Population growth will be faster in the one where everyone has 2 kids when they're 20. At any given time, infinitely into the future, a society with a shorter generational width will have faster population growth than a society with a wider generational width and the same fertility rate. So if policymakers care about population growth, then tempo effects are not a problem. Okay, it's fine to have short run effects. The long run is just a whole lot of short runs stacked on top of each other. But let's see if that's really what's going on here. Next, we can go to our causal methods only approach. So we're dropping some studies. You can see we had 15 long run effects in the whole sample. Now we only have 10 left when we go to just causal studies, but oh no, our effect got even smaller. We're going the wrong direction here. And then we drop studies that we have good reason to think might have been not entirely above board on their methods. And what I mean by that is we have a method called a funnel plot, where we can look at the effect size the authors report versus the standard deviations and the sample size and all these things. And we can compare it to the wider literature, and we can guess how likely is it that that paper came about through an honest reading of normal statistical variation. And it's predictable once we have big enough literature. And so I did that exercise. I'm not showing it here because I assumed for this audience that funnel plots would not be your absolute favorite thing. But regardless, if we drop studies that are way outside of the reasonable variation in a funnel plot of all of our estimates, what happens? And the answer is suddenly we drop one long run effect and we're back up to a positive effect. What happened? Well, I mentioned that paper Parent and Wang earlier that had that huge negative effect. They claim that Quebec's baby bonus caused a massive decrease in the total family size of Quebecois people. Their effect is not consistent with the two other papers that also studied the Quebec baby bonus. And so I would say it's reasonable to drop it because we have other studies of the identical intervention, and their effect size it's difficult to understand how you would arrive at it through normal statistical variation in the data. So the short run effect is still smaller than the long run, the long run effect is still smaller than the short run effect. It's true you lose maybe a third or half of the effect of your policy to just time shifts. But even in the long run, on a cohort level, yes, giving people money for kids makes them have more kids in total. So ultimately what's going on is this one study, Parent and Wang 2007, that makes some dramatic claims about what happened in Quebec. We have more recent studies of the same case that show different and more credible effects. So I think we can say Parent Wing 2007 is a bunch of pea hacking that we don't need to listen to. So we can drop it and believe that there are long run effects. So if we take those long run effects and we say, let's go to every below replacement rate fertility country in the world, every country in the world that has fertility below, that has surviving fertility below 2, how much money would it take to get them up to replacement rate fertility? What would it take? And this graph tells you in percent of GDP. For countries like South Korea and Taiwan, it's like 10 to 17% of GDP every year spent on cash benefits. That is not plausible. Okay? That would involve paying the average Korean who has a baby something like 8 years of wages in a baby bonus. Okay? So, first of all, no one's going to do that budget-wise. Second of all, I think we can all imagine that there might be some negative side effects of that. That's totally, so to be clear, I am not endorsing these levels of spending. I'm just saying, worst comes to worst, if nothing else works in 2050, this is what we're going to do. And the reason I say that is because I don't believe governments are just going to consent to decline. So if we don't find some other solution, the fallback plan is that we redirect 20% of the economy to just pay stay-at-home moms. Okay, which as a husband of a stay-at-home mom, I'm like not entirely opposed to this, but I recognize there could be side effects. Now, but for other countries, it's much more modest. For a lot of these countries, I'm not showing the exact numbers here, but it's like a couple percent of GDP. In the US, it's a baby bonus of like $150,000. Okay, so like you have a baby, you get a $150,000 check. And like, that's not that unreasonable. And I know that sounds like I just said a really unreasonable thing, but all we're saying is you would have to write a check for baby bonuses that is about 1/10 of what we already give retirees every year. Okay, so like this is a fraction of the cost of Social Security, a fraction of it. Don't even get me started on Medicare. Okay, like we would not have to have that many fewer F-35s to pay for this. If we raised taxes to pay for this, we would still be taxed less than almost any European country in the US. So as much as it sounds crazy to have a $150,000 baby bonus, and to be clear, it is crazy. It would have some serious effects on like labor force participation that might not be what we would entirely want. You can imagine that it could result in unhealthy decisions that some women might make with their bodies that you could get a lot of bad situations. Like, oh, in 1 year, if I have triplets, boom, set. You can imagine bad outcomes if we really did this. But the point is, we could do it. Costs do matter. People are responsive to finances. The cost to purchase replacement rate fertility for most countries is a single-digit percent of GDP. It's usually a lot less than current spending on pensions. And while it's an amount that would have disruptive effects on society that we might not want, we should find better solutions. It serves as proof of concept. The first solar panel didn't work very well. It's a teeny little solar panel on Jimmy Carter's lawn, the White House, basically. And they were like, look, we can turn sunlight into electricity. If we'd said at that time, this is ridiculous. Look, it was $80,000 to get this one solar panel, and we shouldn't do anything with solar panels. That would have been absurd. Okay, the proof of concept is always the most expensive version. But in the future, we will make better policies that help families tackle costs, that get us better cost effectiveness. What we know from the current studies is that yes, costs matter. And so targeting costs is a good idea. We just have to find a less costly way to do it.
Well, thank you very much, Lyman. You made something that's very complicated. Thank you for sparing us the funnel graphs. But I think you really made a very clear point that these baby bonuses can make the significant difference. And I also appreciate that you put it in perspective what we're spending for pensions and Social Security. Important point. One question is, does it make a difference to give these benefits to married couples versus unmarried couples?
Yeah, so marriage matters a lot. And like South Korea's had a little bit of a fertility rebound recently, and the most plausible story on it is they did a bunch of marriage bonuses a couple of years ago. It caused the marriage rate to jump up significantly, and fertility rate is responding on like a 9 month lag. Um, so um, I think that we can say that marriage is really important. And so, you can imagine that maybe one of the more cost-effective ways of dealing with costs is okay, like, could we like pay people to get married? Like, maybe you get more baby for your buck by just paying for marriages. South Korea's experience seems to suggest that that actually might be true. You might get a lot more bang for your buck that way. That's another way of saying we probably need to remove marriage penalties from the tax code and from means tested benefits. A lot of benefits, like the earned income tax credit that I mentioned, they punish people for getting married. If you've got two people who they both get the earned income tax credit because they're both, lower working class, and then they get married, they tend to lose their benefit because now their combined income is over the threshold. Well, we could solve that. We could stop punishing people for getting married. Like, this seems very reasonable to me. So marriage is super important. I also think that a lot of people, the reason they're not getting married is because they don't feel prepared to have kids yet. So I think that making kids more financially viable probably also boosts marriage.
Great. Great. Thank you. I totally agree with your answer. Okay, we will now open it up to question and answers, and my colleague Ryan will take over question and answers. And by the way, I see some friends, new friends and old that have joined us, and thank you very much. So Ryan, take over.
We actually don't have that much time for Q&A because it's already 2:45. But reading through the chat box, Daniel Hess brought up a number of concerns with the upscaling of housing. In particular, looking at the type of housing that it's in these apartments, right? Like there's a or two bedroom apartment, and that's not really conducive to family size, especially with today's thinking. So, for a little bit of context, we moved into our house here in New Jersey, and the family that moved out was moving out because the house was too small. They had two kids, and I was like, "Oh, I'm moving my four kids into that same house, and I think it's plenty big." But in the Q&A, just summarizing that a little bit, I wanted to give Anna Claire a chance to respond to that. And Daniel also cited one of Lyman's studies. And so if Lyman wanted to respond to that as well, that'd be fantastic. And I think that might be all we have time for. But Anna, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Yeah, Lyman has talked a little bit about how the Minneapolis case, I think, was like selective reforms, basically, and made dense neighborhoods denser. And I certainly, I guess, by bringing up, housing liberalization towards kind of more flexible zoning requirements, things like that. My point is not really about the specifics of deregulation, but more about flexibility in supply. So whether that is, the accessory dwelling units in backyards, like we almost don't know the solution yet. But my point is that, this is a discovery process, and having more opportunities for discovering what would meet families' needs better in housing is better than kind of prescribing, what would be best for them. So I don't have yeah, go ahead.
Did you want me to respond on that, Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, housing liberalization is super important. It's unfortunate when housing liberalization is selective in a way that only creates houses that no one will have babies in. Um, and I would say that, like, if you build enough studio apartments, you probably have enough of an effect on prices that you get like some family formation benefit. Like, it's hard for me to believe that like there's no number of studio apartments you could spam that it wouldn't impact accessibility for other people. But I would just say like you could liberalize other kinds of housing too, and probably get a lot of family formation much more quickly. So like dealing with green belts around cities. And bringing more land supply in, dealing with regulations on infill housing. There are a lot of opportunities to make more family-friendly housing. I live in a neighborhood that's it's one of the denser neighborhoods in my metro area. It's a top 10 or top 12% density neighborhood in America. It has some apartments in it. They're all kind of mid-rise, low-rise apartments. It has townhouses, attached single family homes attached to each other. It has a walkable, I can walk to a library, I can walk to a pool, I can walk to restaurants, I can walk to a grocery store, I can walk to parks. My kids can ride bikes to parks. And also, I'm on a third of an acre lot with a garage and a driveway and some lovely trees. And you can't do like 99th percentile density in a very family friendly way, but you can do 90th or 92nd or 93rd percentile density in a very family friendly way. And so densification doesn't have to mean building these like family hostile neighborhoods. It can mean building a very livable kind of density. And I would focus a lot on, we want to shift, 60th percentile density neighborhoods to be 90th percentile density neighborhoods. I don't want to shift 10th percentile to 50th percentile. I'm not interested in like getting rid of farmland per se, right? Like, well, I think one of the beauties of the United States in particular is we do have these bucolic landscapes, so to speak. And I also don't think there's a lot of actual benefit gained from shifting a 95th percentile density neighborhood to a 99th percentile density neighborhood. But there's so much we can do making suburbs, 30% denser, not, Manhattan skyscraper density, and not destroying, not paving over national parks with whatever, but just like you could just cut those lots in half and put two houses where there's one. And it's still a suburban single family neighborhood, just with twice as many children in walking distance from your kid.
Daniel, do you have any clarification as
Oh,
to?
I'd love to. Thanks. Well, I do think it's, the question, and Lyman and I have we've interacted a ton on this, and we're mostly in pretty strong agreement actually. That family suitable housing is incredibly important. But I want to really highlight the case of Asia. The question of, if you have infinite, like, if you have infinite apartments in high rises that are cheap, what's going to happen? We have our answer in Asian cities all over East Asia. You have you've had the sort of the NIMBY ideal of building building these high rises in extreme abundance, and rents are low, and what you end up with is the lowest fertility in the world. You end up in these urban areas, in these Asian cities, in these urban cores with fertility rates of 0.4, 0.5, 0.6 births per woman, which is take the insane numbers that we heard out of South Korea as a whole and cut that in half, and that's what you have in some of these urban cores, which really shows that that simply making housing cheap uh, is not is not the primary fertility solution. The primary thing we need to be thinking about first is making housing family suitable. And Lyman has actually done some really incredible survey work, uh, showing that actually what Americans want overwhelmingly are single family homes. They don't have to be on a 5 acre lot, but want their people really want a single family home. What they're getting in abundance is really often the thing that they don't want, uh, apartments. So I think we really need to, in terms of fertility, we really need to think far more um, about the housing type. We can see this in cities actually all over the world where the suburban ring around the cities can have a fertility rate of 2 times what it is in the urban core. We see that in London. We see that in Australian cities. That's a really common feature that if people have the right housing type, which is a single family home, ideally, fertility seems to be vastly higher. So we should liberalize in that direction, open up horizontally, and think about liberalizing housing that way, not liberalizing the type of housing that really is associated with the world's lowest fertility levels. So I do have a strong issue with the ideal of sort of the George Mason contingent, which there's a libertarian thread which I've I had I've debated with some of these people, um, that we just need to get rid of all the rules, but actually what rules we're thinking about matter a great deal, and so we really need to focus on liberalizing, zoning outward. Your greenfield development, as Lyman has talked about, much more that, if you just allow infinite vertical building, you're actually going to take things in the opposite direction in terms of family friendliness. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly. It's a puzzle.
But if I can, because we need to wrap up, just summarize kind of what I'm hearing from all three of our speakers, um, is that it's not so much the one size fits all, but it's allowing people the flexibility to do what's best for them. If they want a single family home, great. If they want an apartment, great. If they want to work remotely, great. If they want to work from the office, great. But just allowing the people to have that own self-determination, then they can figure out how their ideal family works into how they're, leading their life, right? And so the more that we can focus on giving people those options and the options that they want, then the more they'll be able to have children and they'll be able to fit children into the lifestyle that they want. Is kind of what I'm hearing is kind of the overarching theme from everybody's presentations. And with that, Lynn, I'll give it back to you to close us out.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much, Susannah and Anna Claire and Lyman. It's been very, very rich and just information we really need to get out and apply policy and innovative policy. This is recorded and it will be up on our website in a few days. So please check that out if you want. Please join us. I think our website is in the chat box, and we are having a program May 14th. And thank you again. This was a superb panel. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for joining.